Sorry, I should record that.
It's a consistent frustration.
We get an napkin.
Is Nikiforos? No, not you, papas. Oh, άλλος Nikiforos, the Archangel. Ένας Nikiforos υπάρχει. Oh, there you go. Okay, I didn't see it. The blessing of the Archbishop. Let's offer a prayer, please. We're going to chant the Demacopoulosat, and the Archbishop asked that we, especially and Sergei, our honored guests, that as we chant this beautiful hymn, we think of those who are suffering in Ukraine by this unjust invasion. Good evening. Christ is in our midst. I will not be long. I'm just acting. When we organized this, I'm Father Elias. I'm the Chancellor for the district. Nobody knows who I am anyway. Who cares, right? Father Elias. Just organized this event. And when I mentioned it to the Archbishop within minutes responded in an email, "This is a great idea. Let's make this realized." So, on behalf of His Eminence who's here with his great presence, I want to welcome Sergei Chapnin, who is our honored guest, and Dr. George Demacopoulosat, professor at Fordham University and good friend and brother in the Lord for many years. Also want to recognize three regional commanders, Nikiforos Matthews, George Tsougarakis, and John Kasimatis, for hosting us. Father John Lardis and your parish, first class, thank you very, very much. And Philopoulos, yes, can't forget Philopoulos. So without further ado, welcome, and let's have a beautiful discussion. And in our hearts and minds, of course, let's keep in mind of those people who are suffering and fleeing for their lives as we have this reflection and discussion. I'm the Chancellor, right? I should know the program. Let's welcome His Eminence Archbishop of Demacopoulosat.
Παρακαλώ καθίστε, please. So, dear Father Elias, the Chancellor of the district, beloved Archons, dear Fathers, dear host parish of Archangel Michael, our panelists, Sergei, Chapnin, and George Demacopoulosat, dear friends, this evening's content, understanding the role of the Moscow Patriarchate in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, is a sorrowful and indeed painful subject for us all. This unjust fratricial war must not be laid at the feet of our Russian sisters and brothers who are being deceived and victimized by their leaders, both civil and religious. Even the poor Russian soldiers being sent as cannon fodder into Ukraine deserve our sympathy and our prayers. But for those committing atrocities, there will be justice in this life or the next life. The images coming out of Bucha fill our hearts with much pain and righteous outrage. And as we contemplate the loss of innocent life, especially of children, I ask this one thing. Please rise and join me in a moment of silent prayer to our Lord Jesus Christ on behalf of all those who are suffering. Thank you. And thank you for standing in solidarity with the people of Ukraine. Thank you for extending mercy and compassion to all victims of this barbarity, especially for those who are suffering most directly in Ukraine as they defend their homeland. They have seen their fellow citizens, innocent non-combatants, brutally and mercilessly slaughtered by the invaders. But it is too easy to condemn those in Russia. We must also extend our compassion to those who are standing up and speaking out against this immoral and senseless conflict. To those mourning the deaths of their sons, who were sent to die for the vanity and the madness of others, and to the ordinary people who are suffering from sanctions that their rulers, political and ecclesiastical alike, avoid without harm. Thank you as well for standing with all those who are defending the truth against the onslaught of lies being perpetrated to justify this unjustifiable war, with deceit being sown even here in the United States. When we think of the role of the Moscow Patriarchate in this conflict, the first thing we must marvel at this is the question itself. Should it not be clear that the Church, by its very nature, by definition, is opposed to such a fabricated conflict? We should all certainly hope so, but what is more insidious is the fact that the attackers themselves, are the Christian brothers and sisters of the very ones that are being sent to kill and destroy. It calls to mind what Abraham Lincoln said during America's bloody Civil War, just a few weeks before it ended. He said, "Both read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each invokes his aid, God's aid, against the other." This invasion is of a one sovereign nation by another. But make no mistake, it is causing a needless religious civil war. In this respect, responsibility for condoning such unrighteousness rests squarely on the leadership of the Russian Church, and clearly, personally, on Patriarch Kirill. We all remember what the members of the Sanhedrin cried out as the unjust Pilate sat in judgment against our own Lord Jesus Christ, when they said, "We have no king but Caesar." From the words and actions of Patriarch Kirill, we can conclude he has made the same bargain with Putin and his cronies. This is indeed a sad moment for our church, and the whole world is watching us. These actions are in stark contrast to the Moscow Patriarchate's own Metropolitan of Kiev, His Eminence Metropolitan Onufri, who has stood with his flock despite the silence of his brother bishops across the border. One can only hope that the Ukrainian Orthodox, who are divided between the autocephalous Orthodox Church of Ukraine, that these people, under his Beatitude Metropolitan Epiphanios and the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, will find a bridge of fraternity and solidarity to come together as Orthodox Christian brethren, so as to sustain their fellow Ukrainians. In the meantime, even as we learn from tonight's dialogue, let us take to heart the words of His All Holiness, our ecumenical patriarch, Bartholomew. Just a few days ago, His All Holiness was among Ukrainian refugees in Poland, and he taught us all how we must approach those whose lives are being ruined, Ukrainians and Russians alike, by this unconscionable war. He said, "Continue to remember that for the grace of God, any one of us could be in their vulnerable position. Then your hearts will melt. Your fears will become your fears. Their pain will penetrate your own body. Their hopes will become your hopes. And this entire crisis will be the standard by which your identity and love are measured and judged." These are the words of our Patriarch. Let us pray to the Lord, my dear brothers and sisters, to Kyriou deithomen, Kyrie eleison.
Okay, your Eminence. I'd like to thank everyone for coming. My name is George Demacopoulosat. I know many of you, I've spoken in this parish many times. Let me begin with my thank yous. I'll introduce my colleague, and then we will get into a discussion that hopefully will allow you to understand a little better the inner workings of the Moscow Patriarchate and why what is happening is happening. So to begin with the thank yous, Father Villas, maybe a month ago, reached out to the Archon leadership and to myself and said, "We need to do an event on this. George, can you speak?" And I said, "I can, but it will be much, much better if we bring my friend Sergei." for reasons that you will soon understand. And Father Villas set in motion with the regional Archon leadership, Nikiforos Matthews, George Sougarakis, John Casamadis, and the national leadership set in motion what we have tonight. I'd like to thank Father John Lardis, Father Michael Palomera, one of my former students, for offering their parish. I'm sorry? Yes, for offering their parish for this. And of course, I would like to thank Philoptochos, who provided the fabulous meal and did everything to prepare for this. Your parish didn't even ask for this, and you ended up doing it. So we're deeply appreciative of all the hard work behind the scenes that goes into this event. So why did I say we should invite my friend Sergei to be a part of this? I've known Sergei for about 6 years. Sergei is from Moscow, deeply, deeply involved in the church, a very, very faithful Orthodox Christian. I've known him through my work at Fordham. He's a senior fellow for our Orthodox Christianity and Human Rights Project, which is funded by Leadership 100, among other things, in the Henry Luce Foundation. And so Sergei is a theologian. He's a jack of all trades. He's a theologian, he's a publisher, he's a journalist, he's an art critic, he's a cultural critic. He ran a journal for the Moscow Patriarchate. He worked for the Moscow Patriarch for how many years?
14 and a half.
For 14 and a half years, he worked for the Moscow Patriarchate. I think the best word to describe his current situation is he is a political and religious dissident. He came to the United States a couple months ago because the situation was no longer tenable for him to speak his mind about the corruption in the Moscow Patriarchate. Pray for him. He still has family, a wife and a son in Russia. The situation is not good, right? But we'll talk about other things. So anyway, I wanted to do this, I wanted to organize the event in this way so that we could hear from the inside about the situation in Russia. All right, so I'd like to begin. Sergei, tell us a little bit about what you did for the Moscow Patriarchate, your experience, 14 years you say, and we'll go from there.
Yes, thank you for the invitation, and I'm sorry, my English is not very good, so I'll try to do my best. Well, maybe I should start from a different point. I was 20 years old when a big celebration of the millennium of baptism of Russia took place all over, at that time, Soviet Union, including Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Belarus, and other, at that moment, republics of the Soviet Union. And that was a beginning of a very inspiring and, I would say, wonderful, miraculous period of our life, of the church life, which we call religious revival. And I was very active as a lay person. We have brotherhoods at that time, the big lay movement all over Soviet Union, and our small brotherhood, which was based in the city of Klin, which is sort of 60 miles from Moscow, had branches in Moscow and even in Chicago. In 5 years, our bishops decided that lay movement is something, I wouldn't say unorthodox, but something dangerous for the hierarchy, because on this grassroots level, there was clear idea what we have to do, how we should work in parishes, restore destroyed churches, organize youth work, and so on. And bishops were, at that time, very Soviet. They were somehow, they were trained to be obedient to the state, I would say almost 100% of bishops are at that time, by late 80s, were well trained by so-called the Council for Religious Affairs in Soviet Union. So there was already conflict between the almost flourishing parish life in Russia and the really strange and disappointed position of the hierarchy. That was more or less balanced by the end of the 90s. But the second thing actually that happened was that this whole kind of structure of Moscow Patriarchate that was receiving orders from the state almost ruined, because the state, after the collapse of Soviet Union, the new Russian Federation and Ukrainian state and others, they were not interested in religious life at all. They were trying to be democratic at that time, and they just didn't know how to deal with the church. And the church at that time was also quite democratic. I could say that all the churches in now independent states receive autonomy, like Ukrainian church, Belarusian church, the churches in Baltic states, and the churches in Kazakhstan. This kind of democratic period in the church was as short as the democratic period in the state. When Putin came to power, he decided to kind of revive the idea of Russian Empire. And little by little, he was building this, not just the Russia as a core of the empire, the Russian Federation, but also all the institutions, political institutions, social institutions, and religious institutions within Russia, are elements of this kind of new empire construction. We didn't really realize at the beginning, none of us actually was thinking that it will be as bad as now. But there were signs that the serious change in the life of the society, the state and the church already sort of taking place. Almost at that time, Patriarch Alexis died. That was 2008. Kirill, Metropolitan Kirill, was elected and enthroned as Patriarch. And that was the end of the period of this religious revival. I would say that was the period of Patriarch Alexis. A new period came, and I should say a few words about myself, of course. So I was at that time, I was an independent journalist and a lay Christian activist for 10 years. I was running the small religious agency that in mid-90s, that was the first agency that was dealing with religious information. And that was quite interesting because even journalists, not just kind of state officials, but even journalists didn't know how to speak, how to write about religion, about the church. So it took them years to get acquainted with the traditions, with the context. In 2001. And I got acquainted with the Metropolitan Kirill, I think, in 1997. And I should say that at that time he was a different person, literally. He was a different person when he was elected as Patriarch. And I was sort of working with him for a few years. I cannot recognize him. Such a dramatic change because of our, basically because of power, of course. And that's really the great temptation. And we see that even sort of well-trained and with experience of running one of the biggest departments in the Department for External Church Relations of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill didn't manage to cope with this power, and that's changed the church a lot. The church that we have now in the Russian Federation definitely is not the church that I entered in the 90s. And this is not only my own judgment, but lots of priests, those who are 50 like me, or even 70, 75, they're saying that we lost our church. There is something different. We could call it ideological department of the state, or a kind of political party where the ideology is the main thing and all the rest is sort of the second and the third. So when we started to discuss this, we came to the idea that we could call it our post-Soviet civil religion. So which has elements of Orthodox rituals, traditions, but that's just the form. This is not the essence of what we have. So in 2001, rather suddenly, I was invited to join the publishing house. It was the publishing council of the Moscow Patriarchate, and reorganize the official newspaper of the Moscow Patriarchate, Церковный Вестник, the Church Herald. Honestly, I wasn't happy with this invitation, and I said no. But then my father confessor told me, well, just accept this invitation, because church invited you to work for the church. Just do that. Okay. I was sort of liberal, already marked as liberal at that time already in the church. I said, well, that will continue maybe for 2-3 years, and then I will be fired. My father confessed, don't worry, that won't be sort of 3 years, that will be 5. You will be fired in 5. And you're quite young, and 5 years, that's just nothing. So, okay. But remember, the main thing is that the church invited you, so you can't leave, or well, you should be fired. The church should say that we don't need you anymore, and that continued for almost 15 years. So I was a part of this publishing council of Moscow Patriarchate. Then, when Kirill became a patriarch, he gave me also the main official publication of the church, Journal of Moscow Patriarchate. I was secretary of the body called Inter-Council Presence of the Russian Orthodox Church, which was kind of a council that unites lay people, our clergy and bishops, that was preparing documents for bishops' councils and for the Holy Synod. I was the founder of the Festival of the Orthodox Media of the Russian Orthodox Church. So a lot of work, but then I realized, and that was approximately 2012 or 2013, that I don't agree with Patriarch. I don't agree with this bureaucratization of the church and the attempt to make that only one ideology, this kind of ideology of Ruski Mir, is the only kind of allowed ideology within the Russian Orthodox Church. So I started to criticize in my public lectures, in my articles, what's going on basically first in the area of church-state relations, but then also in what's going on within the church itself. I was quite radical, of course. But what happened? A few weeks ago, I received the first letter stating that, well, from a priest from Great Britain, that of course I was reading your article for years, well, you had arguments, and you were sort of saying more or less reasonable things, but you're an extremist. That's too extreme, sort of, to say like that. But today, I have to admit that you were right, and we underestimated actually what was happening in the church for the last 15, 20 years.
Okay, we could just, I think, hear you keep talking, but I'm going to ask a few questions, actually. You mentioned Ruski Mir. So I have several things I want to talk about, but not everyone is familiar with the expression, why it's ideology, why it's problematic. So explain this Ruski Mir teaching and its relationship to the Patriarch.
Yes, well, it's a very difficult question, because the concept was developing and transforming and almost changed its nature during last 15 years. In 90s, when this term appeared for the first time, the idea behind Ruski Mir was the idea of soft power. That was the historical fact that we had lots of Russians and Russian-speaking citizens in these new countries, in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Ukraine, Belarus, Baltic states, and so on. So there should be a program that will keep these people together. Schools are books in Russian, and so on. That was the idea to promote Russian culture. But what happened then? This concept was somehow sold to Kremlin again, approximately 20 years ago. And little by little, the idea behind was more almost opposite. That we have this Russian Empire, and Ruski Mir is a tool or a mechanism that incorporates different communities all over the world. In this first in this ideology, and then sort of practically speaking, as we see it with this invasion in Ukraine, that even the Russian government is is trying to take by force the neighboring country, explaining it as a defending Russians, fighting Nazis, and so on. So this ideology turned to be the justification of the invasion. It's not that easy to explain that's exactly Ruski Mir, because sometimes the state and church officials they're using this term Sometimes they are not using it, but they're using kind of key concepts of, or key, rather, I wouldn't say concepts, I would say mythology of Ruski Mir to justify these imperial ambitions of Moscow. Because what you know, I'm simplifying, of course, but the concept of Ruski Mir is as follows. On one hand, we have Russian nation, but this is not enough. And yes, and I should say that we have even 3 other words to describe this Ruski Mir concept. It's almost the same when state and church officials are speaking about Holy Rus, Holy Russia. The other term will be Moscow is the third Rome, and the secular version of this concept is Ruski Mir. And Ruski Mir became quite popular as the term in comparison with the others, but in fact Russian society is very secular. It's more secular than the Ukrainian one, and religious concepts would not be so widespread as the kind of secular or kind of para-secular concepts. What we have Russia, that is kind of another important term that is rising from its knees. That's what Putin used to say for years. We have our other countries, big countries, Ukraine and Belarus. We have and Kazakhstan. We have a lot of small countries, and we have somehow to deal with Russian population. On one hand, on the other hand, we have to keep in Russian orbit the other countries, especially Ukraine and Belarus. And there is an interesting reference to Saint Lavrenti of Chernigov. That's interesting that it's the saint from Ukraine, who used to say almost a heretical formula. We cannot divide God the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. This is the Trinity. And in almost the same manner, we cannot divide Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, because this is Holy Rus. And that's the full quotation. In public speeches, you will see only the second half, that Ukraine, Russia, and Belarus is the kind of the Holy Rus. But the first half gives the para-theological justification to the unity that should be by any means and even by force keep together this mythological Holy Rus. Why Ukraine, and why Ukraine is so important in this concept? Because the political center of Ruski Mir is, of course, Moscow. But the historical and spiritual heritage goes back to Kiev Rus, to the 9th, 10th century. And another important turn is that Russian and Ukrainian people have one baptismal font in Dnipro, and these nations came from one baptismal font. So that more or less means that the spiritual center of this Ruski Mir is Kiev. So, and I'm afraid, this is just what I suppose, that why Putin decided to take Kiev first. There is no reasonable explanations, political, economical, sort of nobody knows, no expert could say why Putin is doing that. And the only explanation we have is the religious one, that Putin wants to keep this baptismal font of Holy Rus, to keep it in his hands, because the West, which is the enemy, is trying to to take this heritage, and Putin cannot allow to do that.
Let me ask you about that. I think one of the things that would be helpful for people here to understand is the way that this Ruski Mir concept gets juxtaposed or set against a kind of decadent Western liberal enemy, right? So it's always Russia is holy, Russia's pure, right? Russia's Christian, everything on the outside.
Yes,
yeah.
That's right. What is interesting, this concept actually is a mixture of, well, I would start from a different point. Right? When the religious revival started in 90s in Russia, the idea was to go back to a kind of real tradition of Russia. And of course, that was supposed to be a Christian Orthodox tradition. But because of the 70 years of atheism, they only live, and that's 3 generations. It was much easier for Baltic states, for Poland, for Czech Republic, to go back to their sort of tradition, because they had only 2-generation gap between sort of socialist states and kind of pre-socialist. And in Russia, there were 3 generations. So the traditions were actually broken and almost forgotten. Only if we're speaking about Christian traditions, only small communities actually preserve them, and they can't sort of spread them all over Russia. So the only living tradition in Russia was the Soviet tradition. But in democratic Russia, people were trying sort of to move from this heritage to something else and new. But in Putin's Russia, there was a return, and that's why Stalin again is so popular even among Orthodox, because he revived the empire. Actually, we had the history of Russia is the history of, so to say, kind of 3 empires. The Romanovs Empire, which ended up in 1917. Then there was a kind of sort of bad period of Lenin, and the empire arose when Stalin came. So Stalin is good because he re-established empire, but not just Russian empire, Soviet empire, but still it's the same empire. Then when Soviet Union collapsed, again a bad period came because Yeltsin betrayed, Lenin betrayed the idea of empire, and Yeltsin betrayed the idea of empire. And the 3rd empire in Russia is Putin's empire. So we have this kind of three almost holy empires. And that is why Putin is saying that the biggest tragedy of the 20th century is collapse of Soviet Union. Because as an emperor, he kind of feels that this is his territory, but it's not. So he cannot recognize the reality that Ukraine is an independent state. I think that's what is in his mind. He's just still thinking that this is his empire. And it's more or less okay with Belarus, because though it's an independent state, well, it's very close to Putin. It has the same authoritarian regime. But again, it's different with Ukraine, because Ukraine, and that's the nature of Ukraine. Ukraine is much more democratic than Russia. It was I would say, one of the most democratic parts of the even of the Russian Empire, because of the Cossacks, because of this interaction with Poland, and that's the Orthodox Church in Ukraine and the Orthodox Church in Russia. In fact, in their basis, kind of they have different different traditions. Imperial tradition in Russia, and we could say much more democratic tradition in Ukraine. That's why they're definitely two different traditions. And but the idea of the empire is we should not recognize that. We should say that we're all together and we're more or less homogeneous.
Tell us about Patriarch Kirill. What is motivating him at this point? Does he have any freedom? Like, is he a willing accomplice? Is he a hostage accomplice? Like, why? What is his motivation at this point to not only sit back and let the war happen, but to actively support it?
Well, again, I should start. I'll try to give some context. Patriarch Kirill is an interesting guy. He changed his mind completely from liberal to conservative in the year 2000 and make a public statement on that. He was the first in Russia to speak about traditional values. That was he who introduced this term in Russia. If you look at different publications, secular, religious, you will not find this phrase, traditional values. Never. He was, that's what he introduced to Russia, to the church and then to the society. And that was his kind of conservative turn. He was very involved in the ecumenical movement, as you may know. He was traveling a lot. He was meeting with leaders of different churches and Christian denominations. And then he suddenly said, well, I'm sort of, forget about it. I'm a conservative. From now, I'm a conservative. And in fact, 20 years ago, nobody took it seriously. Well, we almost didn't notice this manifesto that he published. We realized only years later what does that mean for him and actually for the church and for the country, this conservative term. Because when he, as I told in the 90s, the state didn't know how to deal with the church. But Putin was quite pragmatical, and he said, well, what are you going, if you're the church, if you're the patriarch, what will be your contribution to this kind of imperial turn of Russian Federation? And Patriarch Kirill sold, at that time, sort of 10 years later, he sold this concept of traditional values to Kremlin. And that was a big deal, actually, that Putin now, from 2012, from his third period, and that's again, that's a clear line that in 2012, he started to use this term, traditional values. And in his speech before the parliament. And from that time, this conservative agenda became an important part of the political and religious agenda for Russia and the Russian church, outside the country and inside the country. What actually merged? I'm coming back to the point that two traditions actually merged: Soviet tradition and Orthodox tradition. One of the main in the core of Soviet tradition is the idea of enemy. And especially for KGB, but also for different bodies in Soviet Union, the idea that we have enemies, and what is important, that we don't only have enemies outside Russia, but we also have enemies inside Russia. We don't have only enemies outside the Orthodox Church, Russian Orthodox Church, but we have enemies inside the Russian Orthodox Church. So, and we have to be very, very careful, because enemies are around us. They're almost everywhere. And that's actually, and a few days ago, actually, one of the bishops, the Metropolitan Ioan of Belgrade, which is very close to Ukrainian border, when he was commenting that just the example of what kind of religiosity we have among the the politicians in Russia. One of the most, so to say, most religious, most Orthodox governors in Russia for decades was the governor of this Belgorod region. He was for 28 years the governor, and almost impossible, the whole kind of Yeltsin period and almost the whole Putin's period. So now he left, 2 years ago he left his position, and he is now in the parliament. And he wrote a book. And in this book, the most interesting part is that he's writing that 10 years ago, he got acquainted with a lady, a visionary, who was has straight connection with God, with Mother of God, with different saints, with famous figures in Russia. And this governor, for 10 years, was receiving kind of personal revelations how to rule the region, how to sort of manage the things. And at the same time, he was, as I told, he was the kind of most Orthodox governor in Russia. So the bishop, who was with him for also almost 20 years, he was criticizing the name of God, there's another name of God, kind of monotone, monoplan, like that. So definitely not Christ. The bishop, and this governor wrote that the Prince Vladimir of Kiev, when he baptized Rus, that was the wrong decision. The country went in wrong direction, and this god monotone was expecting that the country will go the different way. So when the Metropolitan John was commenting that, he didn't pay attention that this is non-Christian, but the main accent in his comment, he was kind of complaining that, no, Prince Vladimir was right that he baptized Rus. And he added this phrase, well, you see, we have lots of enemies outside and inside. And those who were friends are actually, could be enemies. And that means actually that you're living in the hell, that you're not living in the real world, but the main thing is sort of you're looking at people around you, and you should sort of think, who is the enemy?
And do you think this is what's going on with Patriarch Kirill? He's concerned that everyone's an enemy?
Yes, exactly. Because he even said, that was maybe 10 years ago, that we have also an important term, that we have traitors in cassocks. That means that we really do have our enemies inside the church. We don't know that. Well, of course, we know Chapnin, he's an enemy for ages. But there are many other enemies, and we definitely have to find them, to search for them, to find them, and to isolate them. That's how the country and the church is living.
Okay, I want to ask a couple questions. We're going to let some people in the audience ask questions. I want to ask just a couple more, specifically about the situation for the church in Ukraine. First, I want to ask you about the Tomos of Autocephaly and how that played in the Moscow Patriarchate. And then I want to ask you about what you think might happen for the Ukrainian Orthodox Church still under the Moscow Patriarchate and the Autocephalous Church. So first, when the Tomos of Autocephaly was issued, was this a non-event, like for the Kremlin? Was this a non-event? Was it an event? How did that play inside the church?
Well, it's really a very big question, and I'm sorry, I have to simplify things that I shouldn't simplify. But why Putin and Kirill are very close for years? Because Putin was ruling the country in borders of Russian Federation, and Kirill was ruling the church in borders of former Soviet Union. So it was a key issue for him to keep Belarus and Ukraine, especially as the biggest parts of the empire that kind of fall apart, to be somehow under spiritual control of Patriarch Kirill. And that's the idea behind. So that is why Kirill wasn't able even to suppose that he will give or he will be forced to give autocephaly independency to the Ukrainian church. I know that there were voices in Russian church, and especially in Kiev, that we should start the process of unification. We should discuss this. And what is interesting, and it's absolutely out of any media coverage, that the year before the Tomos was given to the Ukrainian church, there were very serious consultations between the Kiev Patriarchate, the Patriarch Filaret Denisenko, and Moscow Patriarchate. They will reunite. And there were secret missions from Kiev to Moscow with kind of bishops and priests involved, that Filaret and his church will reunite with Moscow Patriarchate. These consultations were so serious, and that Patriarch Kirill even allowed to concelebrate priests from Kiev Patriarchate, which is supposed to be sort of 100% non-canonical, with his old friend from Moscow Patriarchate in one of the Moscow churches. And the bishop of Kiev Patriarchate was in the altar when this concelebration took place. So it was supposed that during Bishops' Council 2017, there will be a kind of reunification. But what happened? Russian Church decided not to make any sort of quick decisions, but to establish a committee. And you know what does that mean, to establish a committee. So the very same hour, Moscow Patriarchate insisted that Filaret should write a letter to the Russian Church without mentioning that he is a patriarch, sort of stating that he would like to reunite. And there is this letter, it's available in the internet, that Patriarch Filaret wrote with his hand a short letter with just a few phrases, and it was presented to the Bishops' Council. So Philaret was 100% ready for for unification on a very on the conditions of Moscow Patriarchate. And when Moscow Patriarchate decided not to reunite, he said, well, there were no talks, this is just nothing, this letter is not true. And of course, he and actually the whole Ukrainian church, the whole Kiev Patriarchate was insulted. And within a year, they immediately started negotiations with the Ecumenical Patriarchate, and that's it. So, and behind this lays the idea that no way that Patriarch Kirill will give autocephaly to Ukraine, because even now, I think the only way to preserve the structures that are still the Ukrainian Church of Moscow Patriarchate is to grant immediately autocephaly to Ukrainian Church. Or otherwise, what we have now in Ukraine, you know, that during the very first days of war, when priests and lay people realized that Patriarch Kirill has sort of no word of support for Ukrainians, no word of support. I just can't imagine that's happening. They said, well, first we stop to commemorate the name of Patriarch Kirill during the liturgy, and now, and what is interesting, that was the initiative of the clergy. Bishops were sort of keeping silence, and now quite a few dioceses, the clergy of quite a few dioceses is saying that, is applying to Metropolitan Onufry sort of to call our Bishops' Council and proclaim autocephaly, literally like that. They're asking, proclaim autocephaly. And I think that the vast majority of priests in Ukraine are in favor of this decision. But bishops are keeping silence. That's again what we have. Bishops in Russia are keeping silence about the war, or they preach in favor of the war, some of them, or keeping silence. And bishops in Ukraine are they are against the invasion, of course, but they are keeping silence in terms of kind of canonical issues arose now. So I think the situation today is still unclear. But definitely there's no future of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Moscow Patriarchate in Ukraine. And I think the only question is today is that whether the parishes of the Ukrainian Church will join the autocephalous Church as parishes, or there will be decisions of the diocese to join the Ukrainian Church, autocephalous Church, as a diocese.
Well, I could, yeah, thank you. Okay, of course, Your Eminence. Thank you so much for coming. Yeah. Yeah, Father. So we'll take, if anyone, the Archbishop's left. If anyone else would like to leave, you're dismissed. However, we will we won't keep you here late, but we will take some questions from the audience as well. So Father has a microphone, and we'll pass around if anyone has a question you'd like to ask Sergei.
Could I ask a question?
Go ahead, Father. You grab the microphone.
Since I took the microphone, thank you for the presentation. I think I'm only going to speak for myself because after following you, Mr. Sergei, on social media and Facebook, hearing the presentation tonight, I'm still ignorant to the situation. A lot of us in the church and maybe our society in our country we're not even remotely close to understanding the history of the Patriarchate of Ukraine and the various churches. Sometimes my generation is only exposed to short YouTube videos that can't cover any part of the subject. Again, being potentially naive and being prayerfully optimistic, can you estimate a best case scenario right now for this situation? Again, being very prayerfully optimistic, what could happen and what is the best case scenario? Before His Eminence left, you said there's potentially no future for the Ukrainian church under the Moscow Patriarchate. So what is the best case scenario, optimistically speaking? Thank you.
Well, sorry to say, but I think this is not, for the moment, this is not the time for kind of optimistic prophecy. Well, I would say that as we all now understand, or at least feel, that not only Russia and Ukraine are changing, but the whole world is transforming. I think the same with the church. I think the whole Orthodox Church, the Orthodox Church worldwide, will transform in a way that, well, the first attempt to describe this kind of we should I should have put it. You know the declaration on the Ruski Mir teaching that was published on Public Orthodoxy. That was the first attempt to describe what is wrong in not only within the Russian Orthodox Church, but also there are signs of the same same ideology, elements of the same ideology in almost all the local churches. We don't have the language yet to describe it. We're just trying to to define this language. And of course, there's a lot of critique, and but we should. I think we should definitely go on with that. What is wrong, especially with the Russian Church? That's quite easy. We have the hierarchical structure, just hierarchy and nothing else. No conciliarity, no subordinate, or just the elements that are trying to to justify this hierarchical structure of Russian Church. So, in order to survive, Russian Church had to transform, and I would say that. Again, that's about language. I will try to put it in the following way: that we have the official church, and this is the basically patriarchal, and all those who benefit from this model of church-state relations that we have in Russia now. But yet we have to remember, and I'm very thankful to Archbishop. He is all the time trying to separate Russia and Putin, those who are who commit military crimes in Ukraine, Russian military, and those who are trying to voice anti-war, participating in anti-war meetings and publish articles against the war. So within the church, we have the official church, and we have parishes that actually lead a kind of true Christian life. And when we're criticizing the official church, we should be very careful with Christians in Russia. They are suffering under this current canonical, rather non-canonical situation that we have in Russia. Parishes are almost nothing. The bishop could easily remove the priest and appoint another one. He could. Priests are almost slaves of bishops. I don't know how to describe that, but just believe me, they're just slaves. And if the slavery survived, we should speak not only about, I don't know, Africa or other regions, we should speak also about Russian Orthodox Church. We have real slavery. And this is, lay people are not involved, but that's just the relations between bishops and priests.
Elia, you found next question?
Michael Stefanakis, two questions. The first is, what percentage of the Ukrainian Orthodox belong to the Moscow Patriarchate versus the autocephalous Ukrainian Church at the moment? And the second question is, can you elaborate on your definitions of liberal and conservatism, as you spoke about it earlier? Because for the most part, Orthodoxy maybe can be synonymous with conservatism in a way. It is a conservative faith. So I was curious what you meant by the liberalism.
Well, the first question, of course, we could only say about the situation before the war. And the Russian or the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, Moscow Patriarchate, was the biggest religious community in Ukraine. Of more than 12,000 parishes. I don't remember, a few hundred monasteries, and the autocephalous church had 7,000 parishes, and now we see how, for example, there were parishes were kind of transferring from since 2018 from Moscow Patriarchate to autocephalous church, but there were no transfers of monasteries. And now two monasteries in Lviv region said that they moved from Moscow Patriarchate to autocephalous church. And I will say that this is the most of a significant change in a religious situation, because monasteries were all very faithful to Moscow Patriarchate. And there's also in the biggest monastery or the most important monastery in Ukraine, the Kiev, in the caves, Lavra. As far as I know, there's a split between those who are still in favor of Moscow Patriarchate and those who are sort of ready to leave. So we will, I think we will see what's going on.
And what does liberal mean in the context of the church?
Yes, well, of course, yes, I have to agree that this is totally wrong to say about liberals and conservatives in the Orthodox Church, and we have lots of discussions about that in Russia for at least last 15 years, and there were some suggestions what terms we should use instead. but we're still using these terms, kind of liberals and conservatives. We can't leave this paradigm. Of course, the reality is much more complicated. For example, when I'm speaking this conservative term in Patriarch Kirill's life, that was political term, of course, because liturgically speaking, for example, he is a liberal. He is in favor of Russian language during the services.
Yeah, rather than Slavonic.
Rather than Church Slavonic.
So it'd be like
yes.
modern Greek rather than Byzantine Greek.
He supports the kind of frequent communion, and the Russian tradition. And he was sort of the rare communion, and so on. But politically speaking, he is a conservative. This is not this when we're speaking about liberals and conservative. This is not that much about the religious tradition and theology, but the way the church should be organized. Higher conciliarity versus hierarchy, support of the state against the sort of the independent church, ecumenism against isolation, and so on.
Father John Lardis from the Archangel Michael Church. Just a real quick correction. I just wanted the food today was sponsored by, we have 14 archons of the Archangel Michael Church, and they're the ones that are hosting the food tonight. So I just wanted to thank our archons from our and the question that I wanted to ask was in listening to some radio programs and the use of the word fascist of the West, and somehow that's kind of been like a hidden term or code term for anti-Semitism. And where does the role, is there a sense of anti-Semitism also in these events that are unfolding between what is present in Ukraine and quite the Mother Russia of Moscow?
No, I don't see signs of anti-Semitism in this case, not at all. But what is important to know about the propaganda machine in Russia is that they actually operates on the level of rhetorics. For example, traditional values. What is traditional values? If we will look carefully at what Patriarch Kirill, Metropolitan Hilarion, and others, and Lavrov, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Russia, what they're sort of saying outside Russia and what they're saying inside Russia, it seems that there are two different concepts that we have of traditional values that we're trying to sell the conservatives in the West, and what they're trying to sell to the people in Russia. The same with fascism. When there are no sort of evidences that there is fascism in Ukraine, but only this private battalion Azov and some pictures of their banners usually are these kind of evidences of fascism in Ukraine. But politically speaking, when we're speaking fascism in the country, that means that fascist political parties are represented in parliament, they have fascist media, and so on. And nothing of that you can find in Ukraine, just nothing. And vice versa. When we're speaking about this kind of traditional kind of structure of the society in Russia, we see that it's almost fascist in an Italian way, because this Russian state is the state where the most important role is played by corporations, different corporations, kind of military corporation, kind of railroad corporation, and church, in fact, from the point of view of the state, is what is a religious corporation within Russia. So that's why, if we have a few minutes, my idea is that, have you heard of the Pussy Riot case? The punk group performed on the ambo of the Christ the Savior Cathedral 10 years ago, February 2012. And the state was really tough. The two girls were in prison for 2 years. What actually happened? That also a kind of our example, what is in mind, in Putin's mind. If the church is a corporation that is sponsored by the state, then the only way for the church is to pray for health and well-being of state authorities, including president. What actually these girls did, their prayer was Bogorodica Putina Progoni, Mother of God, cast away Putin. And that was something absolutely unexpected by President Putin, because, well, I'm paying money, you should pray for me. And when he realized that religious reality is not that simple, you can pray against. This is that what made Putin really angry, and that is why these girls were sentenced, and nobody was able to help them, because that was a kind of religious revelation that you can pray against the earthly power. And I think now many people in the world are following this, are joining this punk group prayer with exactly the same words.
One more question, my classmate from seminary. Thank you for it.
Sergei, thank you, George. We really enjoyed your presentation. We have observed a certain mobilization between South Korea, Africa, the infusion of so-called exarchies. There's even reports about Turkey and other regions of the Ecumenical Patriarchate right around the backyard of the Mother Church of Constantinople. And obviously, at the same time, we have heard from reputable sources and published articles about funding that has been extended towards clerics, media, even political authorities in said regions and elsewhere. Is Ukraine just a symptom? Can we, at this point, say that this is not a benign, but this is an expression that it's not just Putin that's the problem, but the hierarchy also presents with a serious challenge worldwide for the Orthodox unity and for the Orthodox Church?
Well, I will start again. I will start from. I will try to give a different perspective on that. What is the kind of major difference between Ukraine and Russia in terms of religious legislation, which actually affects the life of the church? In Russia, the officially recognized kind of body of the church is Moscow Patriarchate. And Moscow Patriarchate, as a organization, has its founders, private persons. So, and this Moscow Patriarchate actually owns all the church buildings, which is sort of, I don't know, 40,000 churches or monasteries or other buildings or even more. And the parishes are only, and monasteries are actually only using this property. They are not the owners. And in Ukraine, it's vice versa. The basic kind of the parish is the sort of the basis for religious life. They are real religious organizations, and everything that is above, the dioceses, metropolia, they're just the coordinating centers and nothing else. So that is why, and the parish actually protected by law. And that is why bishops in Ukraine are not this hierarchy in Ukrainian church, even in Moscow Patriarchate, is not that strong as in Russia itself. So I would say that the way the church should change in a global scale, I think is somehow like that the parishes should be more substantial, play more substantial role in the life of the church, and all the bodies should be recognized as the kind of the service kind of service for parishes. That's of course in crucial kind of. This is not sort of the Byzantine-style church or Russian-style church, but that's, I think, the direction we should move in the 21st century.
All right, please join me in thanking Sergei for his office.
Let us pray to the Lord. Eternal Father, Lord Jesus Christ, and all Holy Spirit, we praise and glorify you for your mercy, your endless compassion. And we bow our heads before your most sacred presence in prayer and supplication for those who are suffering in the Ukraine and all of those who are suffering from war throughout your world. Help us to remember your presence and mercy in everything that we do, to be ambassadors of your love and mercy for all those who surround us. And the Lord God grant rest to those who were brutally taken from this world, granting them rest and resurrection from the dead. Amen. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. God bless.